So, so what we're going to be covering today. So, just a little bit about me and why I am joining Ethan today on this session. So, my background is in college admissions and college counseling. So, prior to working at College SA Guy, I spent 6 years total working in college admissions. 4 of those years were at Pomona College in Southern California. It's one of the Claremont colleges, if you've heard of the Claremont colleges before, about an hour outside of Los Angeles, all highly selective schools. And then College of the Holy Cross, which is also a selective college. As of recently, it's really there's actually a slide about this. It's really ramped up its selectivity, as have many other colleges and universities in the US. So this ain't your mama's highly selective admissions process is what I like to say. And of course, a lot of you are parents tuning on the call, so you're like, you might be talking about me. So yes, the admissions landscape in the past 10 years has definitely changed a lot, especially from maybe some of the names of schools that parents and families may remember from when they were applying to college, or maybe even an older sibling or whatnot. And definitely each passing year, there are new challenges, but also new opportunities at the same time for students to shine and share their skills, qualities, values, and interests with a broad range of schools that are hopefully a great fit for them. So that's really what we're here today to talk about. The biggest poll and request when we ask students and families who sign up to learn and get support from College SA Guy about what do you need more help with, the biggest response by far has been applying to highly selective colleges. So that is my background, right? That's kind of what I did as an admissions officer for several years. I also worked at an independent school as a college counselor, working with high school students and families who are applying to a wide range of colleges. So that's what I'm here to share, spill the tea on how these schools make decisions. And please don't hold your questions back. I love using this platform that we have at College SA Guy to share insights that previously used to be things that I was sharing with students and families in a school setting. I want this to be widely available and public to people across the world. So that's what I'm here to do. So this session today is all about what highly selective schools are, how the process has maybe changed in recent years, and some recalibration of kind of what selectivity actually looks like, and how just having strong grades and test scores, of course it's test optional right now at a lot of schools, isn't necessarily going to swing doors open for you when it comes to certain colleges and universities on your list. We'll also talk about what types of courses, recommendation letters, essays, and extracurricular activities highly selective colleges tend to prefer. I'll do a little bit of a preview of kind of how admissions officers actually make admissions decisions behind the curtain at different colleges and universities. And then we'll end with some pragmatic action steps that you can be taking, juniors, those of you who are students, as you start to wrap up your junior year of high school, to put your best foot forward to apply to these range of colleges. So that's our ambitious agenda. We're going to try to get through as much of it as possible and leave time for Q&A throughout. And again, Ethan will be Vanna waiting in the chat, as will Renee. So questions galore, keep them coming. I'm just going to keep plugging away with content. All right. So what are highly selective colleges and universities, and why are so many students interested in attending them? So this may seem like kind of like an obvious question, right? But I found in working in this profession that there's a lot of varying definitions of what a highly selective school actually is. So we're just going to do a little bit of norming as a group here today, knowing that we're all coming from, at College SA Guy, students tune in from all over the world, coming from lots of different types of schools, some that have advanced placement classes, some that have IB courses, some that don't have any of those at all. So we're all kind of coming from different places, the 227 of us on this call. So what I'm going to present to you today is going to be as universal as possible to you as a group. But again, feel free to ask more specific questions based on your school, your path, your journey as the session goes along, because we're going to keep things pretty general, as this is an introduction to applying to these schools. And we have a course that's a lot more in depth and allows you oodles of time and hours with me to pick my brain about various admissionsy things. Food for thought, and kind of just some calibration and kind of like settling in, and ideally drinking some coconut water and just nourishing ourselves with some facts. These three stats here on the screen, I really want to underscore from the beginning, because a lot of times, especially depending on some students and families, if you are coming from a high school environment or local area where a lot of students around you are also looking at competitive colleges, it can feel like everyone is going through the same journey as you, and that you all have the same pain points and everyone's vying for spots at the same places. And while that can definitely feel true, especially depending on your local environment and what you're really present to, the reality is the math behind that is not mathing, right? Most students in the United States and even internationally, right, are not attending highly selective colleges. And in fact, most colleges in the United States, there's about 2,800 that are four-year colleges that grant bachelor's degrees to undergraduate students, is what that's called, right? And most of them have acceptance rates that are above 50%. So when there's headlines like getting into college is impossible, that is actually not a true statement, right? Getting into college is not impossible. There are definitely schools where the math is very daunting and it is very unlikely that the majority of students will be admitted. Those are highly rejective colleges, right? Selective, rejective, whichever term you prefer, but they both kind of mean the same thing. But again, depending on your college list and how balanced you make it and your how you approach this process, you can definitely attend college if that's a goal that you have in mind and you're tuning into this webinar right now. It's also, I think, important to remember that only 0.5% of US high school graduates attend what are called the Ivy Plus, the Ivy 11. So that's all the Ivy League colleges, which are, let's see if I can remember them, Dartmouth, Cornell, Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Penn, and then MIT, Stanford, U Chicago, and Caltech. Those represent what are called the Ivy Plus, the Ivy 11. They are the most selective colleges in the United States that often have a lot of name recognition and awareness around them. And they only represent 0.5% of high school graduating seniors. So that's, again, food for thought that it's okay to be a part of the 99.5%. And it's also at the same, I'm holding that same statement in the same time with, it's also okay to pursue those options if they're exciting to you and you feel like they're a good fit for you. It doesn't mean you will be admitted because, again, math is math. But it's a great goal to pursue after, and we're here to try to support you with that if it's something that's important to you. And lastly, and this doesn't necessarily mean that public institutions are not highly selective, because many of them are, such as the University of California system, University of Michigan, Georgia Tech, University of Texas at Austin. But the vast majority of students in the US are also enrolled at public institutions, most of which are not those highly, highly rejective schools. So again, no matter kind of what your college list looks like, you can go to college, you will do it. And where that ends up is time will tell, but we're here to support you regardless. So what do I consider to be a highly selective school? In my experience, I would say any college that has an overall acceptance rate of 30% or below is one that I would consider highly selective. Now, you might be hearing that and thinking, gee, in my mind, I think of a highly selective school as a school that only admits 10% or less of students. I would say, from my time in the profession, from my colleagues who work at lots of different highly selective schools, that once you start to get to this point of turning away about 70% or more of all the applicants who apply, that's when colleges start to get choosy with students that they can admit. In the United States, right, we have lots of different college options, and schools that are less selective, so the ones that are going to be admitting majority of their students, their main job is to get butts and seats. They are there to fill a class. They're the enrollment management, the admissions team. They're there to admit students who will do well academically, who will, be able to contribute to campus, who are interested in attending and can do fine there. And that's the majority of how most colleges work. Also, ability to pay is a substantial factor at a lot of US colleges and universities too. Highly selective schools are different. They have a range of students they can choose from, so they can be more choosy. And because of that, their college's leadership will give the admissions team directives, a term that's called institutional priorities, which I'm going to get to in a second, which really do underscore why certain students are admitted and other students are not. I am going to give you all during this webinar some practical advice that, regardless of if you have an institutional priority that you meet, or a hook is another term that's often referred to as this. We have a great blog and a YouTube video. You're going to recognize the narrator for that good old YouTube flick. It's yours truly. But if Renee or Ethan want to share that in the chat, if you are interested in this term and want to know more about what I'm referring to when it comes to these directives, that the college's leadership, the board of trustees, the president are telling the admissions team, this is the growth of our university, and we have a range of talented students that we can choose from. So there are certain students from certain regions of the world, backgrounds, genders, connections to family who've come here before. That's known as legacy. Every college, unfortunately, in the United States, there is no, one institutional priority list to rule them all. every individual college does things differently and is prioritizing different things each admissions cycle. So for you as an applicant, it's really difficult to plan to meet an institutional priority for a college or university. And I have a slide about this in a second. But that's just all to say that there are things that you can control in this process. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how you can put your best foot forward with your application. But you also have to recognize at the same time that there are things outside of your control that are influencing why certain students are being admitted and others are not. And it has nothing to do with your talent, your drive, your ambition, your qualities and values, and everything to do with the needs that an institution is identifying is part of their growth plan as an institution, which sometimes the things that you're into or interested in just aren't in alignment with what that school is hoping to bolster. So highly selective schools also generally practice what's called holistic review. If you've attended any college information night or webinar or info session, you've probably heard this term before. But again, just to norm us all, it basically refers to a distillation and a constellation, if you will, of different application components that don't necessarily have a clear set weight that they all have. That each individual college is going to be considering when making a final admission decision. So oftentimes application components that go into highly selective schools are things like your transcript, a school profile that shows the admissions officer what courses are available in your individual high school so they can know what you left on the table when it comes to academic offerings. They'll know things like recommendation letters from a teacher or counselor potentially, essays that you have to write as part of your application, an activities list that includes your resume of things that you've done in high school. So those are all things that are components of what's called a holistic review admission application process. Some schools offer interviews, some schools don't. Again, the variety of each individual college makes it a little more challenging for you as students and families, but that's what that term refers to. Highly selective schools are often also seen just in the national consciousness and even internationally as well. You know, there's jokes in the media and movies about how people from far corners of the world, you know, who haven't necessarily been to the United States have heard of Harvard University. It's on t-shirts, you know, I think there's like Princess Diana, there's like a bunch of like pictures of her from rest in peace, from her wearing lots of different college gear, like crew neck sweatshirts and leggings and whatnot. And so even in the UK, right, like people are familiar with a lot of the highly selective and elite US colleges. And through that comes a sense of, you know, notoriety. And when you tell people at a dinner party or just on the street, you have a bumper sticker, a lot of times people are really attracted to having a name of a school signal the work that they put in their life. I have a lot more of a skeptical view on that because I've worked at these schools and I don't necessarily think, and there's a lot of evidence that shows this, that selectivity and exclusiveness does not correlate with quality of education or a meaningful experience when it comes to college. So I think it's great to pursue these schools if they have programs, attributes, things that are valuable to you. And we're all coming from different cultural contexts as well. And some of us come from places where prestige and recognition and national name is something that's really important to our family or our community. So this is not a value judgment for anyone who's tuning in, but I do think that there is a lot of great attributes that highly selective schools have to offer that can also be found at a lot of other colleges as well. And I just want you to make sure to keep that in mind as you build out your college process. Last 2 points I want to make about what highly selective schools are is that they also tend to be financially generous schools when it comes to need-based financial aid. So highly selective schools tend to have financial aid policies that exclusively prioritize their financial aid budget for those who need financial aid to attend. That's a distinction between colleges that offer what's called merit-based aid or merit scholarships. That's purely based on what a school defines as merit. So that may be your grades, maybe your test scores, maybe certain talents that you're bringing to campus. There are some schools that offer generous merit scholarships, a few that are highly selective, but in general, the more highly selective and difficult it is to be admitted at a college, the less opportunities they have for scholarship money, aid money, not based on actual financial need. So for students who are low income, particularly those of you who are maybe international students who have high financial need, international students who have high financial need often really target highly selective colleges because they typically tend to have the financial aid policies that make it possible for them to attend college in the United States. That also comes with a lot of heightened competition. So if you're an international student tuning in who has high financial need, we definitely encourage you to have a pretty deep college list with lots of options, more so than I'd say any other population who's applying to college in the US. because the range of schools you can apply to is a little more narrow than most US students who are applying, regardless of their aid needs. And then lastly, kind of like I said before with the 0.5% of high school graduates, highly selective schools also only represent a sliver of the total colleges and universities out there. There's about 65 or so that have acceptance rates of under 30% currently. So again, lots of options beyond these places. This one I'm just going to go through really, really briefly, and the course kind of touches on this just a little bit more, but these schools are not perfect, right? No college is perfect. And if any college that you tour, you leave thinking that there's nothing bad about it, or, when you're researching colleges, a great thing to do is look at, for example, the student newspaper. That shows you at the college campus, what are the students protesting about? What are they upset with the administration about? What are challenges that students are facing on that campus? And you'll see that even among highly selective schools, it's not perfect. Students there have challenges. They struggle with things like imposter syndrome, where they're surrounded by brilliant students who are coming from all these walks of life, who have done all these really cool things. And that can be really inspiring on one hand, but also really intimidating on another. No place is perfect. Highly selective schools definitely have their challenges, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be pursuing. So also applying to highly selective schools, I may have thrown out a few terms here and there that if you're new to this whole process, you're like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. Again, the course and all the materials we have at College Essay Guy are really meant to try and inform you as much about the language of applying to selective colleges. So terms like institutional priorities, committee, demonstrated interest, shaping, yield, territory management. These may be new to you, and you'll learn a little bit about what they are through this session today. And then, of course, a lot more as you go along with the college process with each step, and you familiarize yourself with the different components. So institutional priorities, speaking of which, I just want to spend a little bit more time talking about this point because in my experience, it is the one that is the most misunderstood. So again, institutional priorities, as I mentioned before, these are these directives that go into how the final admissions decisions take shape at different colleges and universities after a student kind of has their foot in the door academically with their grades and courses that they've taken. Typically students who are applying to these highly selective schools are pretty self-selecting. The majority of them have experiences in their high schools and their communities that show leadership and impact and initiative. And they have a lot of kind of the attributes more broadly that these colleges are excited about. But even among students who kind of reach that benchmark, they still have to make decisions on why certain students should be admitted and not others. If the application pool, if 70 to 80% of them are just admissible purely based on academic credentials, something has to happen to get that to 7 to 8%, which many of these selective colleges, that's their actual acceptance rate. So some of the terms that you see here on the screen, again, the YouTube video and the blog that I mentioned will go into a lot more depth about what those mean. But this is just, again, to underscore that there are things happening behind the scenes you don't have control over. And the more you recognize that, the more I think you can go into this process with more clarity and confidence in the things that you actually can take control over and have autonomy over as you put your application together and choose your colleges wisely and things along those lines. So how does the selective admission process in 2024 differ from the process that's 10 to 5 years ago? What's changing and what has changed? So this is a slide that kind of, I'd say, underscores in the past 10 years why a lot of these application pools at many different colleges have really exponentially increased. So the things that you see on the left side of the screen are contributing a lot to that. And then the things on the right side of the screen are the more recent, more pressing reasons as to why the current admissions landscape, as you might hear it be referred to sometimes, has really shaken up a little bit, right? So overall, more and more students in the United States and across the world are applying to college. College is becoming a more norm in terms of the overall educational progression in the US. So, maybe in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot more students who were graduating from high school and going straight into the workforce. Now we're seeing that college degrees is kind of the norm when it comes to the next step for most students in their educational journey in the US. Not all, but a lot. Populations that weren't always going to college are now increasing in terms of college enrollment because it is now the entry-level credential step for many entry-level job roles in the US. Not all. There's trade schools. There's lots of great options beyond four-year colleges. But statistically, still at this point, majority of professions do require a college degree that pay that living wage that people are aspiring towards. The ease of applying through the common application, that's definitely made it more competitive, right? Because whereas before you had to individually apply to each individual college, now you put one application together through the common application or QuestBridge application, which is exclusively for low income students. So happy to share more information about that if you are low income and you're tuning in, want to know more about that. So it's easier now to apply to a wider range of schools, meaning that the applications are going to increase. Rise in things like early decision and what's called enrollment management. So before, the term, the profession was called admissions, but a lot of colleges have increased things like marketing. They've increased things like buying names and emails of students through testing, sittings. If you are checking your email account and being like, how do all these colleges, why do they all have my information and why are they emailing me so often? That is because you probably sat down for a PSAT or SAT or something, and you checked off, sure, I'll receive information from colleges. So the more colleges kind of amp up the business side of who they are, the more I think they're motivated to increase their application pools and become more selective because they don't want to shut down. They don't want to lose relevance. They want to be able to maintain themselves in this landscape where a lot of people are gunning after those top, most selective schools. And it's becoming harder and harder for those that are not as selective to keep things moving smoothly. Waning trust in public opinion, that's definitely a piece too that's kind of coming into the fold when it comes to highly selective colleges. And there's a lot of variance. Some people say college isn't worth it. Some people say it is. So I'd say highly selective schools are ones that are kind of immune to this overall trend. But in general, there is an evolving landscape in the United States and increasing skepticism about the value of higher education. I had a great college experience. I think that it can be a really transformative thing for people. So I'm definitely a huge advocate for it. But I also understand why people are, becoming increasingly frustrated with the high cost of education and what that looks like. And then some of the things you see on the right side of the screen are also contributing to some challenges in the admission landscape, right? And how the process has changed. So things like the COVID pandemic, right? Not being able to continue taking your classes in person, not being able to take your activity, go and engage with your activities the way that you might have. Many of you who are tuning into this call, if you're juniors in high school, the pandemic was early on in your high school experience, or your transition from middle school, from 8th grade to high school. So developmentally, that's a hard thing to kind of pick up from and to jump right into the standard path that many high school students take in the US. And colleges definitely recognize the challenge that comes along with that. The Supreme Court decision on race-conscious admission, that's another change in recent years. So colleges are no longer permitted to factor in a student's race and ethnicity in their admissions decision if it is not tied and connected to the writing in their essays, connected to their lived experience and what values and qualities their racial identity has instilled within them. That's something that we have a lot of guidance on at College Essay Guy. And just for any of you who are tuning in as students of color who are skeptical or anxious about this ruling and not sure what it means and confused by it because there's lots of headlines and it's really kind of mysterious, know that these selective colleges are interested in students from a wide range of backgrounds, including students who come from underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds. So if you feel compelled to write about that and share about that experience and what that's been like, you have an application to do that, essay opportunities to do that. And definitely colleges are welcome you to share more about where the world that you come from. And that's totally okay and permitted and legally permissible for you to do. There's a lot of talk right now in the past week or so about lots of colleges that are bringing back standardized testing. And when I say lots, I mean actually not really lots, because it's important, I think, to kind of dial down the hysteria around that. The vast majority of colleges and universities are going to continue to be test optional for the incoming first year class, the ones who are going to be applying this next year. There's a few, notable anomalies that have made some headlines like Yale, Dartmouth, MIT, Georgia Tech has, had to maintain testing for quite a while. A couple others that I'm blanking on right now. But the vast majority, again, of colleges and universities, even highly selective ones, still continue to be test optional. So I would say if testing is not really your gig, don't feel like you need to be pressured to really ramp up a ton of test prep and kind of catch up for that, because you can still very well have a college list. I definitely encourage you to think about taking it at least once, just to have it under your belt and see how you perform in that setting and whether or not your score could be an attribute in your process. But you don't have to apply with testing. Changes to legacy admission and things like artificial intelligence are also kind of complicating things. But for the sake of time, I'll move on to our next slide here. So 15 most selective US colleges and universities in the US. This is a little bit of a dated slide, but the kind of teaching moment here for you tuning in is, especially if you're a parent tuning in and you're like, hey, I'm really surprised to see a school, like this might not be super surprising, but like Johns Hopkins or Pomona or Vanderbilt or University of Chicago being just as selective when it comes to an acceptance rate as some of these other Ivy Plus schools. And this is just to underscore that sometimes people will say things like, oh, I won't apply early decision to Columbia because it's so hard to get into, but I'll apply early decision at Northwestern. Northwestern is really hard to get into. And I wouldn't argue that you have this great big, huge change in acceptance rates or proactivity by choosing a school that you see as less prestigious. Because in this landscape, a lot of these schools, again, that are under 30%, and especially the ones that you see here that are all hovering around 10%, and now it's even less since 2019. It's just important to keep that in mind as you're making your list. This is another one. These are the largest declines in acceptance rates over the past a little over 10 years in the US admission landscape. So schools like Georgia Tech, Boston University, Harvey Mudd College, Colorado College, these are schools that maybe some of you have heard of, maybe some of you have not. And overall, what this graph I think is demonstrating for many students, or from when it comes to preferences, is that schools like Georgia Tech and Boston University are, larger schools, medium to large. They're in urban settings, and STEM programs in particular. You see things like Harvey Mudd, Georgia Tech. Those are Carnegie Mellon University is another one in Pittsburgh, has a really renowned computer science program. There's increasing preference among the college-going population today for STEM programs, bigger schools, and urban schools. So if you are targeting these schools, also be aware that there's increasing competition because of the buyer demands and the preferences among applicants for schools with these kind of attributes, programs, etc. Hot off the press, literally as of like 2 days ago, here are some updates from a few different colleges and universities related to their admitted student class, the students who just found out whether or not they were admitted or not this particular year. And what I want to underscore here is that, some of the schools you may see here on the screen, you're like, I've never heard of them before. Schools like Swarthmore are incredibly selective. And, they happen to see a small decrease in their application pool, which is, maybe encouraging a little bit, right? That things are kind of stabilizing when it comes to always ramping up with these bigger application pools, especially when the colleges are not increasing seats or dorms or space to bring in students. That's a big challenge, right? Holy Cross is a school I went there, and when I was working there in admissions and when I was applying, the acceptance rate usually hovered anywhere between 30 to 40%. Now the application or the acceptance rate is now around 16% for their application pool, right? So that is a signal that even schools that 5 years ago might be considered in your community or in your high school environment a more target school, likely school, it's very possible that those schools are becoming increasingly more selective because of this demand. So it's important to be aware of how a school has changed each year and be aware of kind of some of these more recent data points. So that way you are making a college list that is informed when it comes to whether or not the school is a reach school, a target school, meaning you have a kind of toss up of a chance of being accepted, or a likely school, which typically tends to be a school with a very generous acceptance rate, something that's over 70%, where you have a really good shot of being admitted based on your academic profile. And it would be surprising if you were not admitted. It can be very relieving to have acceptances like that under your belt. So applying to schools like University of Pittsburgh, which has rolling admission, or a school in your area that has early action, so you can have an acceptance secured and maybe still be holding out hope for some of these more elite colleges that might be on your list. It's really a good idea to, again, have those likely and target schools to bring you that reassurance that, yes, I can attend college. It is happening for me. And I'll hold hope out for maybe some options that are a little more exciting to me personally. Underscoring that academic perfection is not swinging doors open for students is this, data point from UCLA. Over 20% of the students who applied this year have straight A's, and that's double the amount of students they have the capacity to admit, right? Even College of Charleston, which is a smaller school in Charleston, South Carolina, has also really become a lot more selective in recent years. This was just released this past year, 157% increase, since 2019. So yeah, some big shifts. So for the sake of time, I think I'm going to move through this section of the presentation. And I want to really get into some of the things that you have a little more control over. And as you start to kind of that was maybe a little bit of like the doomsday section of the presentation. Like, it's so hard to get into these elite schools. Should I even bother? You have nothing to lose by throwing your hat in the ring at these places. That's what I always say to students. What you have to lose is maybe your time, right? And actually putting together your application, your essays, and, brainstorming ideas with a trusted friend, a peer, a coach, or a teacher. So that's what you have to lose. You don't really have a lot to lose when it comes to applying to these schools. If finances are a concern, colleges are very generous with fee waivers for students who are applying. So that's something to keep in mind too. If you're like, I can't be racking up $70 application fees every time. So I think it's wise to not spend your every waking minute applying to what's called a term called shotgunning in the admissions lingo, which is basically just like applying to every selective school. Some people use the terms T20, T50, whatnot. Oh, I'm very well versed in College Confidential and Reddit and all these corners of the internet, and so are people in admissions too. So all that to say, these are some of the things that you have a little more control over in the process that I'm about to underscore and give you some tips around. So first things first is understanding how much each component weighs. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that holistic admission means that a college doesn't say, oh, 10% of the admissions decision is from your transcript, 10% is from your activities. They don't have clear-cut distinctions of a component in an application equating to a certain metric. But overall, colleges have been pretty generous with providing data to, this is a report from the National Association for College Admission Counseling. And actually, Ethan and myself have a podcast series, and I'll let Ethan and Renee drop the link to that in the chat. That's all about these different application components, and we talk a lot more in depth. So if you're on your morning commute to school or work or whatever, and you want to learn more about insights from experts in the college admission landscape on things like courses, I'm on that one, so talk about self-promotion. It's myself and Nitsa Cuevas Macias. I think we did a great job with it. Things like positive character attributes, recommendation letters, standardized testing. We'll be releasing these episodes kind of in the next few months and already have released quite a few of them. So definitely check that out. But this kind of shows you a little bit of how different components weigh. It's important to not, I'd say, overemphasize certain things in your process. So things like AP scores, or interviews at colleges, right? At some schools, these may be more important than others, and it's really important to read the fine print and look at each individual school's what's called a common data set, or maybe their own individual admissions website, to know what's actually important in their own individual admissions process. But this gives you a sample overall of how about 185 colleges and universities that were sampled and responded designate a certain level of importance to different application components. So that's the order that I'm going to go through this presentation with. Courses. This is going to be a very oversimplified version of this, and you're going to have lots of individual questions about your course offerings and path. But my advice to you is to take all 5 what are called academic solid courses all 4 years of high school. So if you are planning on changing, or you're currently in the process of picking out your senior classes, I highly recommend considering taking 4 years, if possible, of English, math, social studies / history, science, world languages. The things that you see here on the screen in terms of actual subject recommendations, in the sciences and math, I'd say those are the most important. So for math, for example, reaching calculus, you're planning on applying to highly selective colleges, even if you're not applying to STEM programs, is still preferred in the current landscape. There's a little bit of nuance there. Some schools are a little more lenient, but in general, it's going to give you the widest range of options if you have the capacity and ability to take calculus. It's common. Language is, I'd say, the area where students will commonly like opt out of taking a 4th year of it. And also, just to answer this question in case you have it, it's collectively 4 years. So say you doubled up in science in 11th grade, but you have 4 full years total collectively, that would suffice to most admissions offices. This chart gives you a sense of the recommended courses from the Ivy Plus schools that I mentioned before. And as you see, it's actually kind of surprising. History and social studies is actually the area that the fewest number of them actually recommend 4 years. But I would still argue that you want to put yourself in the best position possible. And again, these are just 11 schools. There's a lot of other schools that may be on your list that may be recommending 3 or 4 years of that particular subject. A lot of students are eager to specialize in certain areas, or they've defined an academic interest. So they're like, oh, I want to drop out of language or social studies as a senior because I'm really interested in computer science and coding and math, and I want to take more of those areas. I would say you have more options if you stick to this plan, because the vast majority of highly selective schools would prefer and value seeing the 4 solids or the 5 solid academic courses all 4 years, then you kind of making this more own specialized path that you're taking for yourself. Again, there's lots of limitations and you're going to have lots of caveats depending on your own situation, but that's just something I want to mention. Essays. I'm going to go through this really quickly because we're a college essay guide. We have lots of resources on how to put together great essays. We have individual courses that are being offered this summer about the personal statement, supplemental essays that particularly more selective colleges ask students to complete that are usually shorter in length. A personal statement is about 650 words and it's sent to every college and university, for the most part, that you apply to. There's some exceptions like the University of California system or whatnot, but I digress. Your main job when putting together your college essay, and again, lots of resources to help you make this the best piece of writing it can be, is to show your values, to show the things that motivate you. The values exercise at College Essay Guy is like the 101. Like, we recommend you doing this even as soon as after this webinar. It's really quick, it's really easy, and it gives you a guidepost for kind of the things that you're looking for in a college campus community and in your life more broadly, and the ways that you've lived those out. And being able to communicate those in your college essays is really, first and foremost, one big job that I'd say you want to take on with writing this essay. Insight is another quality that college essays definitely tend to possess at these highly selective schools. So it's not just giving a play-by-play of events. It's not just a narration of like, I left my door, I got a smoothie, I went to school, I went to bed. Ideally, as you went through that journey of your day, there were things, epiphanies, light bulb moments, aha moments that you came to that gave you more realization of who you are, what motivates you, your goals, the things that you value. Being able to communicate how your experiences that you've gone through have led to certain light bulb moments in your life, certain epiphanies, things that clicked for you. That's the type of content that really needs to be oftentimes present in an essay. And a lot of students will stick to the narration and the play-by-play of just a sequence of events and a timeline. So folding in more of those insight moments is definitely going to help your essay stand out. Vulnerability. So what I mean by this is not necessarily that you have to reveal every single deepest, darkest secret that's part of your life as part of your college essay. You do not need to do that to be admitted to a highly selective college. However, in my experience, students who are willing to let their guard down a little bit, especially in these high achieving environments where it's common for students to have lots of impressive things, it's common for students to have lots of things in their application that show hard work and perseverance and dedication and excellence and success. It's less common for students to talk about things that have been more challenging for them, areas of themselves that they have struggled with. Things that they have built empathy around with other people. So there's definitely some more unexpected values and experiences that students can share. And the personal statement can definitely be a place to do that if a student feels comfortable and compelled, but it's not a requirement to put together a great personal statement. And craft, what that means is that it's written well. And by written well, I don't mean that it's like Shakespeare, wordsmith amazingness. You don't have to be an amazing writer to write a great college essay. And I really, really believe that. It's actually, the admissions officers are moving them through them pretty quickly. If you're going in there with really elevated language or a lot of like advanced poetry that takes a lot of dissection, you're actually slowing the admissions officer down, and it's probably not going to leave the best taste in their mouth. So actually more accessible, relatable language and transitions and a story that really flows is actually what you want to prioritize. And oftentimes the language level doesn't need to be all that sophisticated. So these are just some details about supplemental essays. And again, we have lots of different guides on these, so I'm not going to go too in the weeds with them because the course will do a lot more on that. And if you attend the course, a section of it is actually me reviewing certain student work that they send in. So if you have essays you've been drafting, ideas that you have, that's actually the second part of the course. That second section is about kind of giving live feedback on student work. So that's something to look forward to. Recommendation letters. So my biggest piece of advice with this is to not overthink these. Oftentimes, a lot of highly selective schools ask for a teacher letter and a counselor letter. Your school district and school policy may have different rules about that. And what's really important here to remember is that just like with the academics, the admissions officer reads these recommendations in context. So if you're coming from a school where you haven't been able to get to know your counselor really well, or your teachers are usually really busy dealing with maybe more problem children in your classes, that is actually the norm at a lot of different high schools across the world. And people in admissions do not penalize students for not having the most glowing, illustrative recs that are really, really high depth and detailed. First, if you're going to a high school, like a independent school, maybe a small private school where you have gotten to know your teachers and counselors, there usually is a higher bar, and people in admissions are going to want to see more details there. But I'd say the thing to keep in mind in terms of like, you don't usually get to read your recommendations letters before they're sent in on your behalf. That's something that people who are writing them feel more comfortable writing them and not giving you access to them. And also, it's just better for you not to read them as well in general, from my experience, because then you start to overthink things and wonder why they didn't put in the time that you got extra credit on that quiz in the second quarter. And in the grand scheme of things, the things that the people who are advocating for you are including are really, really great. But in terms of kind of like, equipping your teacher and your counselor in your school to write the best letter for you, I'd say providing them with as much information about your goals as possible, the areas of growth that you are proud of in high school. For teachers that you may have identified, I'd recommend prioritizing core academic teachers. And just so you know, in terms of school advocacy, the things that people in admissions are going to be evaluating when it comes to your overall application are three different things typically. So in addition to your teacher and your counselor letter, there's also a document called your school profile. I highly recommend, if you have not done this yet, to ask your college counseling office, your school administrator, or look it up on your school's website and see what this document is. It's a PDF document that's sent alongside of your transcript, your grades and courses, that gives the person in admissions a sense of what courses are available to you. If you have AP courses, honors courses, IB courses, no courses at all, how many students are going on to four-year colleges, what's the matriculation list, so the types of schools that students from your high school are typically applying to. It gives people in admissions a lot more of a sense of the world you're coming from, what the college going culture is like, and then they're able to evaluate you accordingly based on that. So if you're a student who is the unusual for pursuing these highly selective colleges, and most students stay really close to home or local, or they're going to community college, that's going to be read differently than a student who is coming from an environment where a lot of people are going to these selective colleges, and they probably expect that there's more hands-on college counseling at that more well-resourced high school, or there's more conversation and kind of sense of how to kind of go through the process when you kind of come from these varying environments. So all of these things kind of combined help give the person admissions a sense of the school and local environment that you're coming from. Extracurricular activities on that list of kind of how much different components weigh. Students and families, I would say, think that these are more of a tipping point than they actually are in my experience. My biggest piece of advice for you when it comes to extracurricular activities, and as a junior, you're probably already engaged in things right now and you're not really probably changing a whole lot, but I would say to think about initiative and impact when it comes to your activities, and ask yourself, as I'm stepping into my senior year, are there areas where I can take a little more initiative to address a cause or something that I really care about? Or I can try to make a larger impact in either my school, maybe there's a particular policy that has been hurting students and I want to advocate for the administration to change it, or maybe in my mock trial, I want us to go further than we've ever gone before. So I really want us to get more people and go and make it to states. Or maybe I really care about youth literacy and I want to create this initiative in my state to have more and more kids who are struggling with reading pass their exam, right? Whatever it may be, there's such a range of what students are doing when it comes to creating impact. Here are just a few examples from my experience working in highly selective admissions of things that different students have done over the years that show these qualities of initiative and impact. And they're also a little more uncommon. So I'm not saying you have to do things like this to be admitted to these schools. I would just say there are a lot of students who are applying who are part of the leadership of National Honor Society, and a lot who are applying who are captains of sports within their school. So students who are definitely kind of showing things that are a little more self-directed, that took a little bit of initiative and drive, and maybe weren't kind of, the infrastructure wasn't already built for you based on your school offerings. Those tend to be students at these highly selective schools that show the level of motivation, hustle, dedication that usually translates with a broader range of acceptances. I also really want to make a really explicit point that you do not need to pay for a ton of activities or experiences to be a competitive, highly selective applicant. In fact, the majority of the things that you see here on the screen were actually completed by low-income students who are admitted to various colleges and universities that I've worked for, or students that I've worked with who are applying to colleges. So whether that's something like doing oral interviews in your neighborhood, or a student-run podcast, or an Instagram with your digital art that celebrates body acceptances, and you're doing collaborations with other artists who are motivated towards a similar thing. Those are all things that don't cost, they cost very little money, if anything at all. So I think when there are certain programs or summer things at colleges or universities, or research programs that you may be interested in, if those things are exciting to you and you have the financial capability and you want to do them, that's totally your prerogative. But I would say I don't think what the term that's used for these things is called pay to play. And oftentimes, actually, when an application is full of experiences that look like they were purchased as opposed to actually driven by the student's own initiative, it's actually not always the best look. So I'm just going to leave you with that point and have you think about that. I'm not going to have time to go through this because I want to make sure to go through the course and kind of what this really entails. But there's a lot of nuggets in here that the course goes into in more detail, such as how do highly selective schools read applications? And I actually kind of go through the behind the scenes, what it looks like to work for a college, to have a particular region of the world that you're responsible for applications from that area, how you make collaborative decisions with colleagues, what are the types of things that advocate for a student to be admitted. There are things like, for example, this is a real life sample rationale, what's called a prep. Sorry, my computer's a little slow right now. This is an example of actually something that when I was advocating for a student in committee, I actually read this statement. It's a little, it's anonymized right here. But this shows you kind of, again, the things that a person in admissions, there's a lot of shorthand, acronyms, whatnot, that again, I can explain in more detail if you sign up for the course. Action steps. I'm going to go through these really quickly, and then I want to make sure to have the course and make sure to do all the things as we wrap up. But it's really important for you to, again, as a junior, continue to keep progress with your academics. If you've had trips and stumbles, you can write about those in the additional information section of your application to any college and university you apply to, and talk about areas of your academic performance that maybe weren't seamless. But just know that strong grades and courses, depending on what's available to you in your local environment, is something that you want to continue to pursue, especially in those solid areas. Demonstrated interest, that basically means intentional pursuit of getting to know a college through programming that they put on, such as virtual tours, in-person tours, Q&As with students. These are all things that certain colleges and universities, typically the more selective it is, the less important this is in their overall admission process. But I will say anecdotally, as someone who advocated for students, if I knew who they were and they introduced themselves at a college fair and met me at a school visit and wrote me a nice, thoughtful email about the things about Pomona that were really exciting to them, I was more likely to want to try and make a rationale to admit them based on institutional priorities that they're meeting. I couldn't just make up a reason to admit the student, had to be rooted in the directives that I was given from the college's leadership. But I was more likely, with an option of really talented students from my geographic regions that I was reading, to try and opt for the students who actually made an intention to get to know the school, to show me what they've done to explore it, and to communicate that in their application. So that's definitely a job for you to think about when it comes to this application process. I already kind of mentioned pay to play and how you should definitely try to avoid that. Another kind of thing to think about is potentially when you're putting together your college list, looking at data and kind of utilizing data, especially for many of you. We know a lot of students at College SAI are really into STEM. So looking at data of different colleges and universities and seeing, okay, is there a really big gender balance at some of the schools that I'm applying to? If I'm a female applicant, maybe, targeting some schools where it looks like that's not something where some colleges are more committed to having the students be 50-50 as much as possible. So half male, half female identifying. Maybe you want to have more schools where you have a little more of an edge just based on non-controllable factors as you're putting together your college list. It is, I think, smart to think about some things like that. And students that I've worked with before, things like applying early decision to schools where, students from your state are less common. You have more of an edge just mathematically with no effort on your own when you kind of think about some of these institutional priorities that are a little more fixed. Again, you can't always know them, but knowing kind of the data and how it breaks down and trends can influence your overall candidacy. That was a lot of information, and I want to make sure to do a really quick plug again for the course that I mentioned before. But if you want to dive a lot more in depth into this material through 3 different sessions, they're an hour and a half each throughout the month of April. The course is a really great way to do that. And I also want to really underscore, just as with most things that we have at College SAI, we have these free webinars that are a great way to get baseline introductory information. But in these smaller settings in these courses, well, they're not so small, but you usually have a lot more chance to ask specific questions about your own process. And these courses are also pay what you can, meaning that there is a sticker price associated with the course. But if finances are a limitation, we have lots of options at College SAI to make them more affordable. These are the three different themes of what the course entail. So you got a little bit of a snippet and a preview of some of these things in today's introductory session. But the first one is kind of all about like the theory of highly selective colleges, data that kind of shows you what the landscape looks like, some suggestions around alternate paths to maybe consider as part of your college list, in addition to highly selective schools that you're looking towards that still give you the same attributes, the same experiences, the same things that attract you to them. The middle section is a little more in the weeds about how it works. So more clear, concrete advice around activities to think about, how to write about your activities in your application, thinking about your essays, recommendation letters, do's and don'ts about asking different teachers, things to think about. I break them down in what I call the don't sweat it's, the things that you shouldn't be stressing as much about, that I usually see students worrying way too much about. And then the don't forget it's, which are actually usually things that I don't see students and families thinking about as thoughtfully as they should. That usually make you a more proactive candidate. So I'll go into more depth about those. And then the last session is all about a case study of different actual student files with students that we've worked with at College SAI on broad ranges of their college process. And you basically read through all the different cases, you read through all their essays and activities and their transcripts, and it's meant to kind of put the lessons that you've learned from the previous parts of the course into practice. And we actually do a little simulation like we're an admissions committee and vote on which student should be admitted, waitlisted, and denied. And it's going to be harder than you think because, again, a lot of qualified students and not enough spots at these highly selective schools. So if you're interested in the course, we are actually doing a little promotion where if you want to sign up, it's actually, again, my screen, it's like half loading for me. But if you register by Friday, March 22nd you'll get 20% off the total cost of the course using the code early birds. So chirp, chirp, that's the Pomona mascot for the Sagehens. And with that, I'm going to turn my mic off and turn things back over to Ethan.
Crushed it. Thanks, Tom. That was
Hey.
like a rip-roaring good time.
Woo!
Um, yeah, I know that Tom has underscored it a couple times, but I'm getting questions from students in the chat, so I just wanted to put on notice that yeah, this course is pay what you can, so we don't want there to be any financial barrier, and we'd love for you to join if you can, if you want to. Um, and there were questions about essays. We're not going to talk about essays yet because it's still March, and I don't think necessarily you should be writing essays until this summer, but we've got also separate courses, also pay what you can, that are coming up.
Yeah.
So for now, we've got so many lovely questions, Tom, and it's what's one of the things that was challenging was finding ones that are applicable to most students. So I want to flag for a couple of y'all some of the resources. One of the big resources that we're putting together, for those of you who are asking questions about which classes should I take, broadly speaking, you'll find our podcasts. If you go to collegesguy.com/podcast, we'll have lots more on that. But maybe, Tom, I want to let you look at the behind the scenes doc and see if there are like a couple questions that you feel like could be applicable to most or that you feel like you would have something to say about. And while you're doing that, I'll say to everybody else, we're going to give away a free entry to the course for the 10th person who signs up. So this is one of those like old school caller 10. So Tom, if you wouldn't mind just sharing that once more and we'll put the link in. But for anybody who's interested in taking the course, if you sign up today, the 10th person gets it for free. We're just going to basically refund you your money. So if you're already thinking, oh, I'm going to take this anyway, and you're going to sign up, might as well do it now because you'll get potentially, you have a pretty good chance. We did this earlier on the session and there were only, I think, like 15 people who signed up. So you've got a pretty good chance of getting it, maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 15. So we'll put that link in once more into the chat. Thanks, Renee. If you could just throw that into the chat once more. So, Tom, will you, are there questions that you feel like would be most applicable to all?
I haven't taken a look at the
Oh,
question doc just
that's all
yet.
right. You're probably looking at the all the awesomeness that's happening in the chat. Um, okay, one of the questions that students wonder about
Uh,
is the difference between like how do colleges view APs versus dual enrollment. And then there were also questions around, self-study of APs. So let's get into that a little bit, like
Yeah.
how colleges view these different
Yeah.
things.
So actually, what I want to do is show the. So I used to work at a high school called Lakeside School in Seattle, Washington. And Lakeside is a school that does not offer advanced placement classes. It's a highly selective independent high school where you have to, do an entrance exam, and there's a, admissions process to be admitted to the school. And lots of students and families worried that they were behind the eight ball or uncompetitive from neighbors and peers at other schools that had lots of AP classes because they didn't have any in the school. The faculty and the teachers design their own advanced classes at Lakeside. A lot of independent schools, private schools do this as well. And I want to underscore that because the students at Lakeside are being admitted to these highly selective schools, with a high degree of frequency. And it was not the lack of AP classes that held them back. Because again, the admissions officers recognize the strength of the school. They recognize also what was available to the students at that school. So I actually had a lot of students and families spend a lot of time stressing about self-studying for AP exams, adding AP scores to their candidacy. And my take is that I don't think that's actually moving the needle on your application as much as you think it is. In my experience, that's a 1 second, oh, that's cool, nice, cool AP scores. They didn't have AP scores in the class, they must have self-studied. Sure, it communicates certain things about drive initiative, you're going in the extra mile, but in general, there's probably things that you can be doing with your time that are more impact focused, that are actually helping other people, that are using your intellectual interest for a larger purpose. And I would actually try to prioritize your time with things like that as opposed to building up a bunch of AP scores if your school doesn't offer them. If your school does offer them, of course, the admissions officer and team will expect, if you're applying to highly selective schools, that you have taken some of them. And what they're going to be doing is looking at your school's offerings, the average amount of AP classes that students from your high school typically take. So one example is the basis schools. There's a lot of them around the US, but there's basis Silicon Valley, there's basis in Texas. It's very common for kids there to have 10 or more advanced placement classes and to be starting taking those in ninth grade. There's a lot more other schools where it's not the case. And I bring that example up to say, by you not going to a basis school, you're not at a disadvantage in applying. That's the norm and the culture at basis. That's kind of the trends in how students are applying there. There are high schools that some of you are applying where you probably have limits as to how many advanced placement classes you can take. You're only allowed to take 2 per year. Those are put in place by your school and administration to try to keep balance preserved in your life, to not have academics be totally consuming your end all be all. And that's not me saying, anything critical about students who go to basic schools. For students who are all about school academics, and that's a big part of like what drives and motivates them, that's great. But I just say that again to give an example to underscore that comparing yourself to courses and offerings in schools at other high schools is what I would call a don't sweat it. It's an area where students spend a lot of time and stress and anxiety. And what's most important for you to be aware of is the data and the trends from your own high school in the colleges you're applying to. Looking at scattergrams in Naviance or SCORE or Maya Learning, or data that your college counseling office or counselor at your high school can provide to you is going to be a way for you to be able to know more about what it takes to be a competitive applicant to the schools you're targeting from your own individual high school. If your school has a range of dual enrollment, advanced placement, IB classes, International Baccalaureate Diploma. There's a school I brought up in the earlier session called Ingram High School. It's in Seattle. They actually offer the IB diploma, advanced placement, dual enrollment. Sometimes I would be reading applications from students who had a hodgepodge mixture of those different things. Each student had maybe a different reason as to why they wanted to pursue the IB diploma. And maybe some had different reasons for why they wanted to do dual enrollment. Maybe they want to see what it's like to be in a college class with students who are different ages and come from different backgrounds in their high school. That's a great reason to go and pursue classes in a dual enrollment setting. I would say when you're thinking about your course choices, what I want to underscore is regardless of if it's AP, honors, IB, advanced, something original that your high school puts on, you want to prioritize those core academic classes. A lot of students in recent years have been opting for like, admittedly, maybe more sexy classes that like have cool names or are like a different, like an ultrasound class at a community college. That would not be seen with the same weight as a class like an AP biology if your school offers it, or even if you're interested in pre-med. Some students are like, all right, well, I'm interested in medicine. I want to take anatomy my senior year because it's the human body. That's what I'll be doing. If you have an option to take a class like AP biology above anatomy, you can maybe take that in addition as an elective, but they're going to want to see that advanced rigorous class in a core academic solid discipline opposed to the more specialized courses that may be available to you. There's time and space and room in college to do that, or maybe summer courses, but that's my biggest piece of advice.
So one of the things that a couple of folks asked about that I wanted to get into is to, and I'm going to ask it in this particular way, to what extent, Tom, is a C plus a kiss of death? And the student didn't say kiss of death when it comes to highly selective schools.
Blips in grades are not ideal. I think it's disingenuous for me to be like, you can have C's and the doors will fly open, right? I think what I was trying to underscore in the beginning of the session is that the majority of students who are applying who are successful candidates typically have majority A's. That does not mean you cannot apply, but I just think you need to be really realistic with knowing that 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 grade that you received is going to be a point of discussion in the committee setting if your file makes it to that point at these different colleges. And what I would encourage you to do is explain using the additional information section why that may have happened. Was there something about the way the material was taught, life circumstances, and illness in your life? It doesn't mean that the college is necessarily going to see that rationale and be like, oh, well, no problem at all. But I will actually tell you an example. So when I was reading at Pomona, there was a student who applied. It was during the pandemic, and she did have a C in one of her classes in 11th grade. And it was the second semester of her 11th grade when the pandemic first kind of really set in. And she wrote in her application about how she actually had to take on lots of extra shifts at work to be able to provide for her family because both her parents were laid off. And the school supported that. They also let us know about, the family challenges during the pandemic. That was an example of a student having a C where we were expecting and anticipating students to have academic challenges because of how much time they had to spend in, usually when they would be studying for necessary commitments to their family. So a C plus is not necessarily a kiss of death. There's always ways to contextualize that, but I would be disingenuous if I was sitting up here and telling you that it's not going to be something that will impact your candidacy and be a point of discussion.
Thanks for that. Um, Another thing we said we would do, which I'll do shortly here, is we said we would give away a free book for our folks who filled out the form. So I will do that behind the scenes in just a minute here. Other questions that have come in, a lot of it was about rigor and like people asking really specific questions about like, should I take this course? Should I take that one?
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about test scores because that's something that a couple students asked about. And rather than getting into the specifics, I want to ask a question that I think that will apply to a lot of students. And it's something like, so I'll ask it as a two-parter. To what extent does test optional really mean test optional? Do colleges really actually low-key prefer test scores or what? Like, will you talk just a little bit
Sure.
about test scores at particularly at selective schools, Tom?
Yeah, sure. So something I actually think would be valuable for me to pull up, and this won't take no second time at all, is we actually did a recent webinar where we talked a little bit about testing and recommendations for it. So I'm just going to breeze through this really quickly. So testing, right? As I kind of mentioned before, there are a handful of schools that have announced that they're bringing back test optional policies, but the majority of them will still continue to be test optional and or test free or test blind, such as the University of California system, where they won't look at your test scores at all as part of your admissions process. The majority of colleges cite the reason why they're keeping test optional policies because of equity and access, because the biggest point of correlation with doing well on a standardized test is socioeconomic background. Wealthier students typically do better on the SAT by and large across all metrics, right? So each individual college, there's varying opinions on data that different colleges have put out there, especially on ranges of selectivity with different colleges and universities. So this is an example of, as I mentioned before, some schools that are bringing back testing into part of their process or have maintained it. My biggest piece of advice, though, when it comes to considering submitting your scores, the general rule of thumb is that if your scores are around within the middle 50% of what a college advertises on their common data set or their press releases or their website of their admitted student scores, you are demonstrating that for this part of the application process, you are completely within range of who they like to admit from a standardized testing standpoint. and you should feel very comfortable submitting your scores in that capacity. Some counselors and folks will encourage students, if you're on the higher end of that middle 50%, to so say for example, usually colleges will give a percentile of, here's the 25th percentile of students who submit, so kind of towards the bottom end of the range, and the 75th. People who are above the 75th are usually people who have near perfect test scores. So obviously, if you're in that position, you really have nothing to lose by setting in your scores because you're far above what's typically admitted. But if you're below that 25th percentile, that's where I'd say a test optional policy is going to benefit you, right? Because what that means is your grades and your classes that you've taken are now going to be the sole academic metric that a college is reviewing, and a score that would have put you out of commission or made you uncompetitive previously in a pre-test optional era is now not going to limit your candidacy. One thing I will note on this that brings in a little more nuance is colleges are aware. I've seen literature and comments here and there on different message forums and whatnot that, oh, if I go to a more resource school or I go to a private school, I better send in a score because all the other kids from my school will be sending one in. From my experience working in admissions, never did that. If a student met institutional priorities and didn't have a test score, I was much more likely to admit them than the kids with the perfect testing, because there's a lot of those kids out there who apply. It's not unusual. I know that maybe sounds strange, but that's not a rare attribute. But a student who has a really uncommon academic interest or is really doing something that the college I'm working for is looking for, I'm more likely to admit that student if they have the grades and the classes that excite me, regardless of if they had a test score or not. And I work for a test optional college. That's my job, is to like bring in students who the college is telling me they're really looking for. And high testers are not, as long as the average is high for the college you work for, that's fine. Like individual student scores are not actually something that really hurt that when you're collectively reporting out an average range of scores. And the reason why a lot of colleges like to keep them high is because you are ranked higher and gain more prestige among the national population when you have high test scores, because that's associated by the public with high merit. So colleges actually, it's kind of like a vicious cycle where they kind of are incentivized to keep the score range as high, because that means that people will see the school as more selective and better, even though I don't necessarily agree with that. So all that to say, I hope this gives you a little more clarity around like the business side of how standardized testing takes shape. Some individual colleges like Yale and Dartmouth are probably going to see drops in their application pools, and they're biting, they're reckoning with the decrease in applications, which also impacts things like their rankings and things like that. But for the rationales that they put forward and with their own press releases and research, they've made that decision. Again, the majority of schools that are out there, highly selective or not, are not going to be doing that same policy change. I would be very surprised. Last thing I'll say on this note is, if you are a student who is coming from a background, say you come from a school where very few students go to college and you got a 28 on your ACT, and that's the highest score in the history of your high school. Even if your score is below the 25th percentile, it actually would be seen positively by the vast majority of highly selective admissions officers, because based on the environment you're coming from, you are surpassing by far what most people around you are doing. That contextual achievement is something that colleges are really big on. They do it not just with test scores, but with academic, areas of extracurricular impact, or your courses that you've taken as well. So that's just something I'll note as well. If you're a student who's listening and tuning in and thinking, I'm proud of the score that I've gotten because, everyone has told me in my school, or, it's made waves that I've achieved a lot more than most people from my local environment. That might be a situation where, mentioning that context in your application through something like your additional info section, even though it's below the range for a college, is actually an asset to your candidacy because of your relative achievement based on where you come from.
Awesome. Friends, we are going to follow up. We're going to send an email that has the winner of the course. In other words, who got the free course based on who signed up. And we'll also follow up with the winner of the free book from folks who filled out the form at the start of the webinar. So thanks for being here. We're like 15 minutes over, and we know y'all have lives and things. Plus, when we put the recording up on YouTube, it starts to look really long. So we like to cut it off around at least 15 minutes past so that folks will actually like watch it later. But thank you. We love you. We'll see you soon on another webinar. Stay tuned to the email list and have a beautiful week. Bye. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Renee.